People see an older man living alone and immediately assume they're looking at the end of something. A quiet decline. A life that somehow got smaller, without anyone saying it out loud. If that thought makes you uncomfortable, good. Because there's a chance you've been getting it completely wrong. What most people call silence might not be giving up. It might be precision. 1. Living alone is not loneliness. It's selection. When you see an older man living alone, quieter, less visible, more reserved, don't assume he's lonely. Psychology makes a clear distinction most people miss. Loneliness doesn't come from being alone. It comes from a lack of meaningful connection. Some people are surrounded by others and still feel empty. Others sit alone and feel completely at peace. So when a man starts stepping away from unnecessary conversations, from shallow relationships, from noisy environments that offer nothing real, that's not decline. That's awareness. At some point, after decades of responsibility, roles, and expectation, a man begins to see things differently. He no longer asks, "Who wants my time?" He starts asking, "Who deserves my energy?" And that shift changes everything. Research on aging shows something subtle but powerful. Older adults who choose solitude tend to show greater emotional stability, less reactivity, and stronger internal regulation. In simple terms, when silence is chosen, it doesn't weaken you. It clarifies you. There's a real pattern you see in life. A man retires. He stops showing up everywhere. He speaks less. He keeps his circle small. From the outside, people worry. They think he's withdrawing. But look closer. He still meets a few people, consistently. He keeps his routines. He takes care of himself. He moves with calm, not chaos. He didn't leave life. He just left what no longer fits. Carl Jung said it clearly. Loneliness does not come from having no people around, but from being unable to communicate the things that seem important to oneself. That's the difference. When a man understands this, he stops filling every empty space. He lets silence exist, without needing to escape it. Because not all silence needs to be broken. Some silence is where everything becomes clear. And from that point on, he no longer lives to be seen. He lives, without being pulled apart. Not every man who lives alone is lonely. Some have simply stopped giving their energy to what no longer deserves it. 2. Living alone removes pressure and restores emotional control. When you notice a man becoming quieter, less reactive, less interested in explaining himself, most people think he's shutting down. He's not. He's just no longer being managed by other people's expectations. For years, many men learned to regulate themselves around others. Their tone, their timing, their reactions. Not because they're weak, but because peace often required negotiation. They learn when to speak, when to stay quiet, when to adjust, just to keep things stable. But when that constant negotiation disappears, something shifts. The body relaxes. The mind slows down. And for the first time in a long time, there's no need to brace. Psychology has shown that chronic emotional regulation under social pressure increases stress levels over time. But when that pressure is removed, the nervous system stabilizes. Less anxiety, better sleep, clearer thinking. So when a man chooses to live alone, he's not running from emotion. He's stepping out of constant emotional accounting. No more subtle tension. No more silent responsibility for how others feel. No more carrying moods that aren't his. And from the outside, this calm can look like distance. But it's not distance. It's control. There's a real example you see often. A man who spent decades in a demanding relationship. Always adjusting, always explaining, always managing conflict. After that phase ends, he becomes quieter. He doesn't argue anymore. He doesn't react the same way. People around him might say, he's changed. But what really happened is simple. He stopped negotiating his inner state. Viktor Frankl once said, "Between stimulus and response there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response." Most people never fully access that space. They react. But a man who has stepped out of constant pressure finally lives inside that space. He doesn't rush to respond. He doesn't defend every assumption. He doesn't explain himself to feel understood. He chooses when to engage and when not to. And that choice is where clarity begins. Because reduced drama is not emptiness. It's regulation. It's what happens when a man no longer needs to prove himself emotionally. And from that point on, he doesn't carry tension that isn't his. He doesn't react just to maintain harmony. He moves with control. Calm on the surface. Clear underneath. Not every quiet man is distant. Some have simply stepped out of the noise and found control again. 3. Independence doesn't weaken a man. It aligns him with himself. When you see a man living alone, eating simply, moving at his own pace, keeping his routines quiet and consistent, it may not look impressive, but it's often the first time in years he's actually listening to his body. For decades, most men don't live on their own rhythm. They live on schedules built around other people. Work, family, obligation. They eat when it's convenient, sleep when there's time, ignore signals, because something else always comes first. And over time, that disconnect builds. But when a man steps out of that structure, something subtle happens. He starts noticing again. Hunger feels clear. Fatigue feels honest. Movement feels necessary. Psychology and health research consistently show that autonomy, the sense of having control over your own time, is strongly linked to better physical well-being and lower stress. Not because life becomes easier, but because resistance disappears. There's a pattern you see in real life. A man retires, or begins living alone. At first, everything slows down. Then gradually, he starts walking more, eating simpler, sleeping deeper. No strict plan. No external pressure. Just alignment. He didn't suddenly become disciplined. He finally had space to respond to himself. This is where most people misunderstand. They think being alone leads to neglect. But in many cases, neglect comes from overload, not isolation. When everything is pulling at you, you ignore yourself. When nothing is pulling at you, you finally hear yourself. As Marcus Aurelius wrote, "Look well into thyself. There is a source of strength which will always spring up if thou wilt always look." Most people never look long enough. But a man who lives alone eventually does. He notices small things. What his body needs. What his mind avoids. What his habits reveal. And from that awareness, care becomes natural. Not forced. Not performative. Just consistent. He walks because sitting too long feels wrong. He eats simply because excess feels heavy. He rests because his body asks for it, not because he earned it. And over time, his life becomes quieter, but more precise. Not every man who lives alone lets himself go. Some finally stop ignoring themselves and begin to take care of what's been waiting all along. 4. Love doesn't disappear. It becomes quieter and more honest. When you see a man living alone, no partner beside him, no visible relationship, most people assume something is missing. But that assumption is often shallow. Because love doesn't disappear when structure disappears. It changes form. Earlier in life, love is often loud, driven by intensity, expectation, urgency. It needs to be shown, proven, maintained. But over time, a man begins to see the cost of that. He starts to notice how much of what looked like connection was actually obligation. How much of what felt like intimacy was built on expectation. And slowly, his definition of love shifts. Psychology points to something important here. As people age, emotional priorities change. They move away from intensity toward stability, meaning, and peace. So when a man chooses fewer relationships, less frequent interaction, and more space, it doesn't mean he's rejecting connection. It means he's refining it. There's a pattern you see often. An older man who doesn't have a traditional relationship, but still keeps in touch with a few close friends. Still speaks to his children without tension. Still connects with people without pressure. No performance. No constant reassurance. Just quiet consistency. From the outside, it may not look like much. But inside, it feels lighter, cleaner, more real. Friedrich Nietzsche once said, "It is not a lack of love, but a lack of friendship that makes unhappy marriages." And a man who has lived long enough understands exactly what that means. He no longer confuses proximity with connection, or intensity with depth. He sees that loud emotions don't always mean real bonds, and quiet presence doesn't mean absence. So he chooses differently. Fewer people, less noise, more truth. Because when love no longer needs to prove itself, it stabilizes. It stops draining. It starts supporting. And from that point on, he doesn't chase connection. He allows it. Not every man who lives alone is without love. Some have simply let go of what wasn't real. So what remains can finally be. 5. Peace becomes the priority, and it is protected. When you see a man living alone, moving slower, reacting less, walking away from things that once mattered, most people assume he's losing interest in life. He's not. He's just no longer willing to pay the price for chaos. There comes a point in a man's life when time feels different. Not endless. Not expandable. Limited. And when that realization settles in, his priorities sharpen. What once felt exciting now feels expensive. Unnecessary arguments, emotional tension, constant stimulation. All of it starts to cost more than it's worth. Psychology consistently shows that as people age, they become more selective with where they invest their emotional energy. Not because they have less to give, but because they understand the cost of giving it to the wrong place. So when a man begins to withdraw from drama, from noise, from anything that disturbs his inner state, he's not disconnecting. He's protecting something. Peace. There's a moment that happens quietly. A man wakes up in the morning. No pressure waiting for him. No emotional negotiation ahead. No need to adjust himself for anyone else. And instead of emptiness, there's stillness. That moment changes him. Because once a man experiences that kind of peace, he doesn't give it up easily. There's a pattern you see in real life. A man who used to tolerate conflict, who used to stay in situations out of habit or obligation, starts leaving sooner. Not dramatically. Not loudly. Just quietly. He doesn't argue like before. He doesn't chase resolution for every tension. He simply chooses distance when something disrupts his balance. As Seneca wrote, "He who is brave is free." And true freedom isn't loud. It's the ability to walk away without needing to explain why. From the outside, this can look like detachment. But it's not detachment. It's discernment. He knows what deserves his time, what deserves his attention, and what doesn't. He stops reacting just to maintain harmony. He stops staying just to avoid discomfort. Because he understands something most people avoid. Peace is not passive. It is defended. And defending it requires boundaries. Clear ones. Quiet ones. Unapologetic ones. From that point on, he doesn't move fast. He doesn't react quickly. He doesn't let everything in. He chooses. And that choice is what makes his life feel lighter. Not every man who lives alone has given up on life. Some have simply decided peace is no longer negotiable. 6. At some point, he stops trying to be seen and starts living true. There's a moment most people never notice. No announcement. No visible change. Just something internal, locking into place. A man stops asking for permission. Not from others, but from the version of himself he used to be. When you see a man no longer explaining his choices, no longer correcting how people misunderstand him, no longer trying to be perceived a certain way, it's easy to assume he's given up. He hasn't. He's just no longer performing. For most of life, men are taught, directly or indirectly, To build a life that can be seen, measured, approved, recognized. They tolerate friction. They carry expectations. They accept emotional debt, believing there will be time to resolve it later. But later doesn't arrive the way they imagined. And at some point, that illusion breaks. Psychologically, this is where identity shifts. External validation loses its grip. Internal alignment becomes the reference point. A man stops asking, "How does this look?" and starts asking, "Is this true?" There's a pattern you'll recognize. A man begins to live differently. He eats differently, moves differently, spends his time differently. Not to impress, not to fit in, but because it feels right. People around him may not understand. They may call it selfish, detached, unpredictable. But what they're really seeing is a man no longer negotiating with himself. As Socrates said, to find yourself, think for yourself. Most people never fully do. They adjust. They conform. They explain. But a man who has reached this point stops. He doesn't argue to be understood. He doesn't defend his peace. He doesn't audition his life for approval. He protects what is his. And that requires something rare. Boundaries. Not loud ones. Not aggressive ones. Clear ones. Because once a man understands what drains him, he no longer pretends it doesn't. Once he understands what matters, he no longer compromises it easily. And from that point on, his life may look quieter from the outside. But inside, it is precise, stable, aligned. He shows up when it matters. He steps away when it doesn't. No guilt. No explanation. Because he's no longer trying to be impressive. He's trying to be accurate. Not every man who lives alone is disappearing. Some have simply stopped living to be seen and started living to be true. At the end of it all, it was never about living alone. It was about this. Who are you? When nothing is pulling at you. No expectations. No roles. No one watching closely. Most people never face that question. Because their life is always entangled. Always reacting. Always adjusting. Always being pulled. But when a man reaches a point where nothing is pulling at him anymore, what's left is not emptiness. It's alignment. That's the part people misunderstand. They think silence means something is missing. They think distance means something is broken. But what if nothing is missing? What if the noise is gone? And for the first time, everything unnecessary has fallen away? Psychology calls this internal congruence. When your actions, your thoughts, and your values stop fighting each other. And when that happens, there's no tension left to perform. There's just presence. There's a real pattern here. A man no longer chasing approval. No longer explaining his piece. No longer reopening old negotiations. He moves differently. Not louder. Not colder. Just clearer. As Epictetus said, no man is free who is not master of himself. And that's what this becomes. Not isolation. Not withdrawal. Sovereignty. A man who owns his time. His space. His attention. He doesn't reject connection. He simply refuses entanglement. Because entanglement drains. And clarity nourishes. So the real question was never, is living alone healthy? That was just the surface. The real question is, can you be alone without needing to escape yourself? Because when you can, you don't feel empty. You feel undisturbed. Peace doesn't come from having more people around you. It comes from having less conflict within you. If this video helped you, subscribe to Silent Stoic. So each day, you become stronger and more at peace. And tell me this. Can you sit alone without needing to escape yourself?